Frederic Leighton was the most eminent artist of the late Victorian period, and travel for him was an important part of his life, dating right back to childhood. His family began to spend increasing amounts of time on the continent, so together with his two sisters and parents, they travelled variously to Italy, spent time in Paris, in Brussels, before buying a house in Frankfurt where they effectively settled, and Leighton was trained at the art school there. So even when his parents returned to live in Bath, Leighton remained on the continent. He spent time living in Italy, then in Paris in his 20s, and even when he settled back in London, every year he would set off back to the continent, perhaps initially to pick up acquaintances and friendships that he'd made there, but more and more travel became an important escape really from his London life.
Frederic Leighton spent much of his upbringing living in continental Europe, and travel around Europe remained an important part of his life from that point onwards. He lived in Rome for a period during the 1850s, and during that time he made really formative friendships with other artists and first discovered landscape painting near the hill town of Novara on the outskirts of Rome. Leighton travelled extensively around Italy, as well as living in Rome. He spent lots of time in Venice and also went further afield to Sicily, and in particular Palermo. The Palace of Lazisa was a significant inspiration for the Arab Hall. Leighton also went on several prolonged trips around Spain, travelling extensively in the country and making use of the newly improved rail network. He became acquainted with the language and made some of his most evocative and distinctive landscape studies, including Bay of Cádiz, which is an unusual moonlit scene.
Frederic Leighton travelled extensively around England, usually motivated by visiting friends or seeing collections that he wanted to look at. But from the 1880s and into the 1890s, he always seemed to have started his autumn wanderings, as he called them, by either going to the remote north of Scotland or to the equally remote northwest coast of Ireland. He would go either to Braemar or to Forres, and it was the Findhorn River nearby that was a particular attraction to him to paint. And then when he was in Ireland, it was the rugged, remote coast of Donegal that he enjoyed spending time around, and particularly took great pleasure in the dramatic sunsets that could be seen there, and he found inspirational for some of his paintings. Frederic Leighton was travelling almost every year over a 40-year period. Slowly, research has been able to establish the extent of these travels, but I don't think it'll ever probably be possible to fully document them. This is partly because Leighton himself didn't record or keep a travel journal systematically, so we're very dependent on his correspondence and how the newspapers, as his fame grew, began to report where he was setting off to, when he was coming back. Is still not really understood. It's quite how he got to and from the places that he was travelling, his mode of transport, the itinerary that led him to his ultimate destination. But it's very clear that a lot of planning went into these trips, and that physically they must have been demanding, because some of the places he got to were really quite remote. He was carrying his own painting materials with him, and as far as is known, wasn't accompanied by any kind of manservant or help. So these were solitary and quite ambitious undertakings that Leighton was making.
Frederic Leighton first travelled outside of Europe in 1857 when he went to Algiers, and he later said that the trip left a great impression on him, and I've loved the East, as it's called, ever since. One of the most significant trips he made in North Africa was to Egypt in 1868. Leighton visited Egypt 3 times, but this was his longest journey. He was given at his disposal a steamer by the Viceroy Ismail Pasha, who Leighton was introduced to by the Prince of Wales. Leighton kept a journal during this trip, rather unusually, and so we know a lot more about his impressions of the Nile Delta, and he was particularly taken with the colours of the surrounding riverbank and mountains beyond, which he captured in his paintings.
So Leighton travelled all around the perimeter of the Mediterranean and spent time in southwest Asia, getting there by, we think, travelling down the Danube and via Turkey and then returning via Greece. And in 1873 he set out for Damascus, arriving there from Cairo, and spent time, a number of weeks, in the city, and seems to have split his time between staying in a hotel in the centre of Damascus and then also in the vacated home of his friend, the explorer and diplomat Richard Burton, and his wife Isabel. And they had occupied a house in a village called Salahye, which is north of Damascus. And so over a number of weeks, Leighton explored the city and in fact wrote that he found it difficult, surprisingly, to find subjects to paint. But he was fascinated by the environment, by the architecture, by the decorative arts, the tiles that he saw there. And we know that by 1873, he was already beginning to think about the building of his Arab Hall.
One of the last trips which Frederic Leighton made before he died in 1896 was back to Algiers. At the time, his health was failing, he had angina, and he had made the trip to recuperate and escape the stresses and strains of life in London. Despite this, he chose to make an almost 500-mile round trip to the town of Biskra to make some of his final landscape studies, showing the importance that he placed on these small pictures.